This week's blog post is on the James Museum of Western and Wildlife Art, Part 1. The James Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida, which opened in 2018, houses the art collection of Tom and Mary James. I postponed visiting the James because I'm more a fan of the Industrial Revolution and the New York City skyline than of the West and cowboys. I should actually know better than to judge things that way, since I've written, for example, on why I love Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Harry Potter. Sense of life or theme almost always matters more than literal subject. I like the sense of life of many of the works at the James very much. Also, the caliber of the workmanship is generally very good, whether in paint or bronze. The sight of good technique in a recent work reminds me that artists are still out there who are capable of creating expressive and evocative works. It's like reading a newly published novel that has a great plot, characters, and style, even if I happen to like the ending. It gives me hope. About the James. For 40 years, Thomas James was chairman of Raymond James Financial, a brokerage firm established in 1962 by the merger of Robert A. James Investments and Raymond and Associates. Today, total client assets under management are about $1.8 trillion. The home of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers is Raymond James Stadium. As a boy, James loved cowboys, Indians, and the romance of the West. Soon after his marriage, he and his wife began collecting art related to those subjects. Since the Jameses make a point of supporting artists who are still alive, many of the bronzes and paintings at the James Museum date to the late 20th and early 21st centuries. As I said, it's quite delightful to be reminded that artists of such high technical abilities are still at work. The James Museum also includes a display of Mary's collection of Indian jewelry. There's a link in the blog post if you're interested in reading an interview with Tom and Mary James. Meanwhile, on to architecture. When I first saw the home of the James Museum, I thought it was a quirky creation of Frank Gehry or one of his imitators. But as one of the helpful docents explained, it was in fact designed to recall the American West. The outside is colored like sandstone, and there's an abstract version of a Pueblo Village on the second floor. That's this here. And this is the greeter. I did not catch a sign that told me who did that work, but he sits right outside the museum to welcome you in. The two-story entrance hall of the James recalls a sandstone canyon, and the waterfall at the far end, that's here, adds a very pleasant sound. The entrance level of the James houses a group of spectacular bronzes, 3 of them by John Coleman. Let me give you the background on these. George Catlin, 1796 to 1872, decided in his 20s that he wanted to preserve a record of Indian customs and Indian individuals. From 1830 to 1836, he made 5 trips to the American West, visiting 50 tribes. Some of the routes were the same as those used by Lewis and Clark in 1803 to 1806. Catlin and his colleague Carl Bodmer painted portraits of some of the Indians Lewis and Clark had met. This is one of them on the left. In the early 21st century, John Coleman, who was born in 1949, decided to recreate in 3 dimensions the Indians depicted by Bodmer and Catlin, but to show the figures as they would have been 30 years before when Lewis and Clark met them. Coleman's figures in the entrance hall are life-size, extremely detailed, and quite impressive. I've given you links to more on John Coleman. There are several other bronzes on the entrance level. Bruce Green, who did this one, is a member of the Cowboy Artists of America. That means that if he shows a cowboy, he has to be meticulous about correctly representing every detail, from the hat to the spurs to the tack on the horses. This sculpture is a young man serenading his intended bride with a flute. This sculpture is as close as any work in the James comes to modernist art. In this case, unlike, for example, most Cubist works, the straight lines and sharp angles give a sense of violent movement that works very well for a bucking bronco. Next week we will look at some bronzes on the second floor of the James. DianeDuranteWriter.com has hundreds of posts on sculpture, painting, architecture, and my other obsessions. To join the free Sunday Recommendations email list, visit the URL that's on the screen or email me. And you can say, "Well done, Diane," or support my work and receive rewards via the tip jar on dianerantewriter.com. As always, thank you for listening.